Sometimes losing everything isn't a tragedy, it's a revelation, because when the structures you trusted collapse all at once, when the plans, the names, the routines, and the identities you built begin to fall like fragile scaffolding, something uncomfortable emerges in the silence that follows. Not panic, not despair, truth. And that truth asks a question most people spend their entire lives avoiding. What actually holds you together when nothing else remains? Imagine waking up tomorrow with no titles to hide behind, no guarantees to lean on, no familiar ground beneath your feet, no applause, no certainty, no protection. What would still be standing inside you? This is not a story about rebuilding faster, winning bigger, or proving anything to anyone. This is about what survives when ambition fails, when control dissolves, and when life strips you down to the parts that cannot be taken. Because sometimes, losing everything is the only way to discover what was never meant to fall. They weren't extraordinary people, and that's exactly why this story matters. No dramatic beginnings, no cinematic promises, just two ordinary lives moving side by side through familiar days. Mornings defined by routine, evenings shaped by small conversations, plans that didn't aim to impress the world, only to make tomorrow feel a little safer than today. They built a life the way most people do, not on guarantees, but on habits. Shared coffee cups, predictable arguments, silent understandings, and the quiet confidence that consistency itself was a form of stability. Their dreams were modest, almost invisible. Enough time, enough peace, enough reason to keep choosing each other. And like a house slowly assembled brick by brick, their life stood not because it was unbreakable, but because it was familiar. What they didn't know, what no one ever knows, is how fragile a structure becomes when it's tested all at once. There were no alarms, no warnings, just subtle shifts that felt insignificant at first. This story doesn't rush toward the fall, and it doesn't glorify what comes after. Because this isn't about conquering the world or proving resilience to an audience. This is about something far more rare, how two people try not to lose each other when everything else begins to collapse. When everything still felt safe, it didn't feel dramatic or fragile. It felt normal, and that was the most convincing illusion of all. Stability didn't arrive as certainty, it arrived as routine, as repetition, as days that looked enough like the ones before them to never raise suspicion. Their emotional balance wasn't built on deep conversations about the future or explicit guarantees. It was sustained by the quiet belief that nothing bad was urgent enough to happen now. Bills were paid, messages were answered, plans were postponed instead of canceled, and that postponement itself felt like control. They believed they were steering their lives simply because nothing was spinning out of reach yet. And in that calm, they confused absence of chaos with presence of safety. Every laugh, every shared silence, every ordinary evening reinforced the idea that what they had was solid, tested, dependable. But the truth was more subtle. They were walking forward without ever looking down, trusting the surface beneath their feet because it had never cracked before. Like walking across a frozen lake that looked smooth, quiet, unthreatening. They kept moving because others had walked there too, because the ice had held yesterday, because stopping to question it would have felt unnecessary, even paranoid. The danger wasn't recklessness, it was familiarity. The lake never warned them, never made a sound, never showed a fracture. And that's how false control works. It convinces you that stability is permanent simply because it has been consistent. Nothing had fallen yet, nothing had broken. Nothing had been lost. And precisely because of that, they believed they were safe, unaware that safety had never been tested at all. The first sign of rupture never announces itself as danger. It arrives quietly, disguised as something small, something almost reasonable. A missed opportunity, a delay that feels temporary, a conversation postponed because there will be time later. Nothing dramatic enough to demand panic. Nothing visible enough for others to worry, and that's why no one takes it seriously. Not friends, not family, not even the people living inside it. The loss is subtle, almost polite, the kind that doesn't interrupt routines or force decisions. Life keeps moving, schedules stay intact, laughter still shows up when expected. And yet, something shifts beneath the surface, like a hairline crack in a wall you walk past every day. You notice it, but you don't stop. You assume it's cosmetic, harmless. You tell yourself that strong structures don't fall because of something so small. After all, everything else still looks fine. This is where the human instinct to minimize takes over. We are wired to protect normality, to preserve the story that things are stable because stability feels safer than uncertainty. So the mind translates warning signs into temporary inconveniences. It's just a phase. Everyone goes through this. This will pass. Those words become a shelter, a way to delay discomfort without realizing delay has a cost. The problem is never the small loss itself, but the meaning we refuse to give it. Because when a warning doesn't hurt enough, it doesn't change behavior. And when behavior doesn't change, patterns solidify. The crack widens quietly while life continues loudly. No collapse yet. No disaster to point at. Just a growing distance between what is happening and what we insist on believing. And by the time the phrase, "this will pass," stops working, something essential has already begun to slip away. The fall never arrives with a countdown. There is no dramatic music, no moment where life pauses to let you brace yourself. It happens in the middle of an ordinary day, disguised as something manageable, something temporary, until suddenly it isn't. A phone call that lasts a few seconds but rearranges the next few years. A number on a screen that erases months of effort. A decision made by someone else that fractures everything you thought was stable. One moment the structure is standing, the next, it's not. The most violent part isn't the loss itself, it's the speed. The mind struggles to keep up, searching for logic, for mistakes, for a way to rewind a few hours and make different choices that no longer exist. Shock takes over, not loud or dramatic, but numb and disorienting. Like a sudden power outage in the middle of the day, when the sun is still out but nothing inside works the way it should. You're awake, but clarity is gone. Sounds feel distant. Time stretches and collapses at the same time. They didn't cry immediately. They didn't scream or break down the way stories usually describe. They sat there, trying to understand how something so solid could disappear without warning, how a life built over years could unravel in minutes. And in that emotional blackout, something subtle but dangerous begins to form. The fear that this loss isn't just about money, or structure, or circumstance, but about identity. About who you are when what supported you is suddenly gone. This moment marks the true beginning of the journey, not because everything ended here, but because from this point forward, nothing feels guaranteed anymore. The day after the tragedy doesn't arrive with noise, it arrives with silence, the kind that feels heavier than the impact itself. There is no dramatic soundtrack, no clear moment where pain announces its presence. Instead, the world continues moving as if nothing has changed, and that contrast becomes unbearable. The floor that once felt solid now seems absent, as if every step is taken mid-air without balance or direction. Time stretches in unfamiliar ways, minutes dragging while hours disappear without notice. The smallest details, once invisible, now carry a sharp weight. An untouched cup on the table, a phone that doesn't vibrate, a chair slightly out of place. These are not memories yet. They are wounds disguised as routine. Breathing feels intentional, like a task that must be remembered. Words lose their urgency, conversations feel distant, and even light entering the room seems intrusive. Nothing is technically broken, yet nothing works the way it should. The pain isn't loud enough to scream, but it's constant enough to exhaust. This is the space no one prepares you for, where survival begins not with strength but with endurance, where grief hides inside ordinary moments and reveals itself through absence, where the hardest realization isn't what was lost, but how deeply life was anchored to what is no longer there. The world has a strange impatience with pain that lasts longer than expected. At first, people understand. They give space, offer words, lower their voices. But time passes and sympathy quietly turns into expectation. The messages change. You're strong. You'll get through this. It's time to move on. Strength becomes something you're required to perform, not something you're allowed to grow into. And while everyone else seems convinced that the worst is over, inside, the processing hasn't even finished. Thoughts repeat themselves in silence. Emotions arrive late and without warning, and exhaustion settles deeper each day, not because of effort, but because of carrying what no one else can see. This is the loneliness of private grief, being surrounded by encouragement while feeling completely unseen. It's like running a long distance with an invisible weight strapped to your body. From the outside, your pace looks normal. You're still standing, still functioning, still showing up. But every step demands more energy than it should, and stopping feels like failure, even when your body is begging for rest. You don't collapse because you're weak. You keep moving because the pressure to appear okay is heavier than the pain itself. In this place, fatigue isn't physical. It's emotional depletion, the kind that doesn't respond to sleep, motivation, or advice. And the hardest part isn't the weight you're carrying. It's realizing that no one else feels it, no one else adjusts their expectations, and the world keeps asking for strength when all that truly exists is quiet, persistent exhaustion. Blame didn't arrive as an argument. It arrived as a temperature change in the room. A pause that lasted a second too long. A look that carried a question no one dared to ask out loud. They didn't accuse each other directly, because direct blame would have required clarity, and clarity was already gone. Instead, guilt began to circulate quietly, passing from one to the other like borrowed air. He blamed her in the way he went silent, as if silence could explain what words no longer could. She blamed him in the way she over-explained, trying to justify feelings she didn't fully understand herself. Neither of them wanted to be responsible for the collapse, yet both felt responsible for preventing it. And so blame became a shield, not a weapon, a way to protect themselves from the deeper fear that maybe this loss had no single cause. In moments like this, guilt isn't about punishment, it's about survival. Because if someone is at fault, then the chaos has a shape. And if the chaos has a shape, then maybe it can still be controlled. The most painful part is that blame often feels like honesty. It disguises itself as logic, as memory, as a desperate attempt to make sense of what's breaking. They replay conversations, choices, missed moments, each one searching for the point where things could have gone differently. Not to hurt the other, but to soothe themselves, because accepting that some losses happen without permission is terrifying. It means admitting that love alone isn't armor, and effort doesn't always equal safety. So guilt moves between them, silently negotiating space, filling the gaps where certainty used to live. And if you've ever been there, you recognize it instantly, that phase where you're not fighting to win, you're fighting to understand why you're hurting. Where blame isn't about the other person, but about the unbearable need to believe that this pain had a reason, a moment, a mistake, something, anything. There comes a moment when the thought of letting go doesn't arrive as betrayal, but as relief, not spoken out loud, not written anywhere, just quietly forming in the space between two people who are tired of hurting. The temptation isn't born from the absence of love, but from the unbearable presence of pain that no longer knows where to rest. They still cared, still noticed the small things, still worried about each other in silence. And that's what made the thought so dangerous. Because it sounded reasonable. It whispered that maybe separation wasn't failure. Maybe it was mercy. Maybe choosing distance was the only way to stop bleeding in the same place every day. In those moments, love doesn't disappear. It becomes heavy. Heavy with memories, expectations, disappointments that never had time to heal. And when every conversation feels like lifting a weight with already trembling arms, the mind begins to search for relief, not solutions. The temptation felt like loosening a grip that had gone numb. like two people holding a heavy load together for so long that their hands forgot what rest felt like. The idea wasn't to abandon each other, but to release the pressure, to breathe, to stop fighting gravity for a moment. Letting go seemed gentler than holding on while resenting the weight. What made this moment so fragile was that it wasn't fueled by anger or hatred or indifference. It was fueled by exhaustion, by the fear that staying would turn love into something bitter, something unrecognizable. And so the question wasn't, do we still love each other, but how much pain can love endure before it starts to break the people inside it? This is the quiet crossroads where many stories end, not with explosions, but with silence, where letting go feels like kindness, even when it isn't. This is where love stops sounding beautiful and starts becoming necessary. No poetic phrases, no dramatic declarations, no moments designed to be remembered later. Just exhaustion sitting quietly between two people who no longer have the energy to perform affection. Love here doesn't arrive dressed as inspiration. It shows up as presence. It looks like staying in the same room even when silence feels heavy, like choosing not to walk away when every excuse would make sense. Their love isn't broken, but it is tired. Worn down by pressure, by fear, by the constant effort of holding life together while everything feels unstable. There are days when affection feels mechanical, when words are replaced by routines, when emotions lag behind responsibility. And yet, something persists. Not passion, not romance, commitment. The kind that doesn't announce itself, doesn't demand recognition, and doesn't promise happiness, only continuity. This is love stripped of fantasy, forced to exist without applause, surviving on the simplest decision: to remain. In this version of love, small gestures become everything. A plate left on the table, a jacket placed over tired shoulders, a glance that says, "I see you," without asking for anything in return. These actions would have been invisible before, but now they carry weight, because they are chosen under strain. Love isn't proven through grand sacrifices here, but through repetition, through showing up again after disappointment, after frustration, after nights where nothing feels resolved. It is imperfect, uneven, sometimes quiet to the point of doubt, but it is real. And reality gives these moments a meaning romance never could. Because when love survives without beauty, without certainty, without reward, it stops being an emotion and becomes a structure. Not something that feels good, but something that holds. When everything finally fell apart, it didn't do so quietly. The loss was visible, measurable, impossible to romanticize. The house was gone. The savings disappeared faster than they could understand. Objects that once symbolized progress were reduced to memories, paperwork, and absence. Furniture, clothes, routines, all stripped away until life no longer resembled the version they had carefully built. What remained was not dignity or wisdom at first, but shock. The strange embarrassment of realizing how much of identity had been attached to possessions, addresses, and stability. Yet as days passed, and survival replaced denial, something unexpected surfaced. With less to manage, less to protect, less to explain, their days became simpler in ways they had never experienced. Conversations deepened because there was nothing else to distract them. Decisions became clearer because there were fewer options. They learned that when life is reduced to the essential, what stays is never accidental. It's like finishing a long, exhausting hike and finally dropping a backpack you didn't realize was crushing your spine. At first, the relief feels suspicious, almost undeserved. Then you notice how light your body feels, how freely you can breathe, how far you've already come carrying far more than you needed. They discovered that what truly mattered had been with them the entire time. Presence, loyalty, shared silence, and the quiet choice to keep walking together. Losing everything didn't empty their lives. It revealed what was worth carrying forward. The fear didn't arrive loudly. It settled in quietly, like a question with no answer that followed them into every room. The future, once outlined by plans and expectations, became an empty space they didn't know how to name. There were no clear next steps, no timelines to cling to, No promises they could rehearse to calm themselves down at night. Anxiety stopped being a sudden feeling and turned into a constant background noise, a low hum of uncertainty that made even simple decisions feel heavy. They learned what it meant to wake up without a map, to move through hours instead of years, to focus on getting through the day rather than imagining the life ahead. Living one day at a time wasn't a motivational phrase anymore. It was a necessity, a form of survival. Slowly, painfully, the illusion of control began to dismantle itself. They realized how much of their confidence had been built on predicting outcomes, on believing that effort guaranteed results, that planning equaled safety. But now, effort didn't offer clarity, and plans no longer protected them. And in that discomfort, something shifted. They stopped asking, "What will happen?" and started asking, "What can we carry today?" The fear of a future without plans didn't disappear, but it lost its authority, because when control is stripped away, presence becomes the only option. And in choosing presence, again and again, they discovered that uncertainty doesn't always destroy you. Sometimes it teaches you how to stand without leaning on promises that were never real to begin with. Staying didn't look heroic from the outside, and that was the point. There were no grand gestures, no speeches about destiny, no dramatic moment that could be framed as a victory. Staying was quiet, almost invisible and often misunderstood. It wasn't the kind of choice that earns applause because leaving would have been easier, cleaner, and far more explainable. Staying meant waking up every day and choosing something that no longer guaranteed comfort, certainty, or reward. It meant loving without the safety of promises, committing without the assurance that things would improve, and remaining present even when the weight of doubt pressed heavily on every routine. This wasn't love as a feeling that arrived effortlessly. It was love as a daily decision, repeated in small, uncelebrated ways. Love showed itself in showing up tired, in listening when silence felt safer, in holding space when walking away would have felt like relief. Staying was not about fear of change, but about courage that didn't need witnesses, like choosing to remain inside a storm not because it feels good, but because abandoning the shelter you've built would leave you with nothing at all. Going would have offered speed, clarity, and the illusion of control. Staying demanded patience, uncertainty, and the humility to accept that love is not proven by dramatic exits, but by quiet endurance. In a world that praises escape as strength, staying became an act of resistance, not against pain, but against the idea that every difficulty must end in departure. This choice wasn't about winning, fixing, or saving anything. It was about recognizing that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is remain exactly where leaving would feel like freedom, and choose love again, not because it's easy, but because it's honest. Nothing changes on the outside, and that's what makes this phase invisible to everyone else. The same streets, the same walls, the same faces reflected in mirrors that don't reveal what's shifting beneath the surface. From a distance, life looks paused, almost unchanged, as if the fall never happened or as if it failed to leave a mark. But internally, something slow and deliberate has begun. Not a dramatic rebirth, not confidence restored in one decisive moment, but a quiet recalibration of trust, first in themselves, then in each other. It starts with fragments so small they barely deserve attention, a conversation that doesn't turn defensive, a silence that feels safe instead of heavy, a promise not made, but kept. Confidence returns not as certainty, but as tolerance for uncertainty, for vulnerability, for the possibility that things might break again and still be survivable. They stop needing constant reassurance and begin accepting progress without proof. This reconstruction doesn't announce itself. There are no milestones, no visible wins, no applause. It's a private process of relearning how to stand without bracing for impact, how to speak without rehearsing loss, how to hope without demanding guarantees. Each small act of trust becomes a brick placed carefully back into the foundation, not to recreate what was lost, but to support something more honest. And while the world sees stagnation, What's actually happening is far more fragile and far more powerful. They are learning, piece by piece, how to believe again without pretending they are unbreakable. It didn't happen in a dramatic moment, and it didn't arrive as relief. The realization came quietly, almost unnoticed, in the middle of everything they had already lost. They looked around and saw what was gone, the plans that no longer made sense, the stability that once felt permanent, the future they had rehearsed so many times in their minds, and for the first time, they allowed themselves to admit the truth without panic. They hadn't recovered everything, but they hadn't lost everything either. What remained wasn't impressive, and it wasn't enough to impress the world. It was smaller, more fragile, and yet strangely solid. It was the way they still reached for each other in silence, the way presence replaced promises, the way love stopped being a solution and became a shelter, not something that fixed their situation, but something that made it survivable. They understood then that love was never meant to protect them from loss, only to give them somewhere to stand when loss arrived. And standing didn't mean being strong all the time. It meant staying. Staying when answers didn't come, staying when fear spoke louder than hope, staying when rebuilding felt impossible. In that moment they saw themselves clearly, not as people who had won, but as people who were still here, still choosing, still connected. The world hadn't given back what it had taken, and maybe it never would. But it also hadn't taken what truly sustained them. Because emptiness isn't defined by what disappears. It's defined by what no longer responds. And they still did. In looks, in gestures, in shared breaths at the end of heavy days. That was the turn. Not triumph, not redemption, but recognition. The understanding that love doesn't promise safety, it offers refuge. And sometimes refuge is enough to keep a life standing when everything else has already fallen. Having everything once meant accumulation. More plans fulfilled, more stability, more proof that their effort had paid off. Success used to look like predictability, knowing what tomorrow would bring, believing that consistency alone was enough to guarantee permanence. But after the collapse, after the noise faded and the excess was stripped away, having everything took on a quieter meaning. It was no longer about what surrounded them, but what remained between them. What saved them was not strength in the dramatic sense, not heroic optimism or blind faith in a better future, but something far less visible and far more durable. The decision to stay present in the wreckage. When everything fell apart, they didn't cling to illusions of control. They learned to speak when silence felt easier, to listen when blame felt tempting, to hold space for exhaustion without turning it into distance. Success became waking up and choosing honesty over comfort, patience over escape, connection over the urge to disappear. In the middle of what was lost, they discovered that survival isn't built from victories, but from endurance shared. The final image isn't one of triumph, but of meaning redefined. Two people standing among the ruins of what once defined them, surrounded by fragments of plans that no longer matter, yet still upright because they are not standing alone. The world didn't give them everything back. It gave them clarity. And in that clarity they understood that having everything was never about what they owned, what they achieved, or what they protected from loss. It was about remaining intact with each other when nothing else could be saved. They didn't walk away with titles, applause, or proof that their choices were understood. And the world would probably say they lost, because the world only knows how to measure what can be shown, displayed, or compared. But some losses are not empty. They are clarifying. When everything that was fragile fell apart, what remained was something quieter and far more durable. Dignity that didn't need permission, values that didn't bend under pressure, and a sense of self that no longer depended on being chosen, approved, or validated. Losing what the world celebrates forced them to keep what the world can never return once it's gone. Inner coherence, emotional truth, and the courage to live without pretending. And maybe that's where this story gently turns toward you, not to give answers, not to offer lessons, but to leave a question hanging in the air. In your own life, When everything unnecessary was stripped away, what did you keep? And what might that say about who you really are? If everything familiar disappeared today, the comfort, the certainty, the things that once defined your place in the world, who would still stand beside you when there was nothing left to offer in return? This question isn't meant to be answered quickly, because the most honest answers usually surface in silence. And if this story quietly brought someone to your mind, someone who stayed, or someone you wish had, let that recognition exist and write EU Escolo Ficar in the comments, not as a promise to anyone else, but as a declaration of the kind of presence you choose to be. And if you want to keep walking through stories that don't decorate pain with illusions, that don't sell hope cheaply, but instead uncover the truth hiding underneath what hurts, subscribe to the channel, because here, the value is not in escaping reality, but in finally seeing it clearly.